Today is the first day of this September 1984 7-day retreat. There were a couple things yesterday in the opening talk that I forgot to mention. I will do that now. If anyone wishes to not face the wall but face outward or inward, whichever way you put it, that's all right to do so. Or to experiment with it. A while ago, in a 4-day retreat, the coordinator suggested that people could sit whichever way they wished to, and a few people reported that sitting went better by not facing a wall. So it's entirely up to you how you wish to face, except that if you do not face the wall, if your back isn't toward the coordinator, she can't hit you. So if you do wish to work with Kyosaku, then you need to have your back turned toward the aisle. Someone may say, are you doing this to do away with another form? Or wouldn't one just do this to react or rebel against the form? Well, this is for each one to find out. What one's motives are, if it needs to be done, if it is beneficial or not, and not to make a problem out of it one way or the other. There's something about facing out if just the coordinators and the person who is called a teacher faces out, then it looks as though there was a special group who does that and everybody else is not that and has to face the other way. One may say, no, I don't feel this way, but sometimes there are subliminal cues that one gets from this. Some people doing it one way and I'm among the group who doesn't do it or does it. Coordinators have to face, they may be face out because there may be somebody coming to the door who may be caught before he or she knocks on the door, rings the bell. It's good that somebody watches in case somebody in the group of sitters is sick or may faint, which rarely happens. I don't know if it has ever happened here. But so that there's somebody there to help if help is needed. It's not a mark of attainment or distinction or position. The other thing I forgot to mention is that sometimes either during a round of sitting or during meeting time I come into the sitting hall and walk by everyone. Sometimes people turn their head, maybe thinking that I'm the coordinator, and I just will put my hands on their shoulder as an indication I have no stake. And people, there are always some people who wonder why I do it, and it is, like anything else, a fertile field for imagination. What is she doing? Is she evaluating me, taking my measure, as it were? Checking on my vibrations, can't give you any special reason why I do it. One is that I can't sit in the meeting room for 2 hours solid. That's too long. It's good to get up at least once, come down, and since we are in this whole thing together, as friends, this is the way I see it. Not as a teacher with her students, but as friends working together. I like to be close every once in a while. Not to look you up or check you out, but just to be together for a moment. Without any sentimentality. It may sound sentimental, it isn't meant this way at all. Just to be quietly together, which is an incredible thing which we do so little or hardly at all during our daily life. We only feel that we're interrelating if we talk together. And talk we do. And yet there's a different kind of relationship which is completely non-verbal. I'm not saying that this does not happen during everyday life, but a retreat is a special opportunity for that. To be with each other non-verbally. On a level which thoughts and ideas and concepts can touch. The koan which I'm using for today is one from the Mumonkan. The title is Tozan 60 Blows. I'm combining in talking about it or in reciting it several translations, so I will not mention any particular author. Anytime you open up a koan book by different author, different translator, the koan reads differently, sometimes radically differently. When Tozan came to have an interview with Umon, Umon asked, "Where do you come from?" "From Sado, Master," Tozan replied. "Where did you spend the 3-month summer retreat?" "At Hozu of Konan," replied Tozan. "And when did you leave there?" "On the 25th of August," Tozan answered. And Umon exclaimed, "A beating is what you need." Another translation says, "I'll spare you 60 blows." And another translation, or it's not just translation there, says, "I'll give you 60 blows with my stick." Some kind of traumatic exclamation. The next day Tozan came up again and asked the master, "Yesterday you spared me a beating. I do not know where my fault was." Umon cried out, "You rice bag! Why are you prowling from Kozai to Konan, or from west of the river to east of the lake?" Or, why are you wandering from one place to another? or from one teacher to another. It says here, at this Tozan was enlightened. Before going into this koan, let me say a few words about why one is used at all, a koan, because sometimes we don't use koans, we just talk about things. Sometimes a koan is used because it can point to something that can be looked at together. It's sort of like a stepping stone to comment on our lives. Not just for the sake of commenting on how we live, but that we may see something which has been mechanical, automatic, unconscious or subconscious. And therefore not clear, and therefore compulsive in some way or another. Koans are not used to express an admiration for these ancient stories. We may have that already. And it needs no support. A koan is not used or there to be admired, but to be understood, superficially as well as profoundly. And not in order to bring one closer toward enlightenment, or in order to get enlightenment from hearing it. These are all ideas. This is one thing that reading, having so many collections of koans and reading them, it does something to one. Any one of us who has read has had this happen. And to one degree or another, for one thing, one doesn't quite understand, or maybe one has an inkling, and then one thinks, if I've worked on this or found the right master, who is like these masters who are described in these short stories, then I maybe could come to enlightenment, whatever that means. In other words, seeing a koan as a means to an end, just as it seems to appear here. This happened and then that followed. The interview was the cause and the enlightenment was the effect. Cause and effect are ways of thinking of human beings. It's the way the brain structures its thinking and looking in terms of cause and effect. And if it's written down in a way, it picks it up as cause and effect. And then one's hopes or aspirations are inspired by that. If this happens, that would follow. But enlightenment or insight are not effects of causes. So this kind of cause and effect thinking does not apply. So koans are not used in order to whet the appetite for enlightenment. One could leave out this line, this last line, and it would be just as important and significant to look at what's happening in this interview. Not just in this interview, but in oneself. And with this I come to listening to a talk. I haven't said this. It's usually said at the beginning of a retreat. First talk. How does one listen to a talk such as this? You may have heard this many times, and if one has heard such words about listening many times, there's a great temptation not to listen anymore because one has heard it. But what one has heard is memory, whereas what is happening right now is alive and real and new. So, can one be there together in this listening, talking? It's not two separate things. Not if the listening comes from the same place as the talking. Not from memory of what one has already said and heard, but from right now, speaking and listening, this instant. So how does one listen to a talk without bringing up memories of what one has already heard and comparing it with that, which is all mental activity and the blockage of open listening? Open listening can only take place when there is no blockage in comparison, evaluation, resisting, because there's something painful aroused within, and the listening stops, and the resistance comes up to listen any further. Can that movement within itself be felt and seen as something that's happening right now, and therefore not disrupt the listening because it is seen as it is? If you're tired of the posture of the legs or back, perfectly all right to change the posture during a talk. It's also good to have a comfortable posture to start out with. Use as many cushions as you need, or a chair, because any noise from moving around may disturb one's neighbor. But if it is done carefully and attentively, it may not disturb. Conversely, if one does feel disturbed by a noise of someone moving next to one, can it also be observed what the nature of the disturbance is? One may say, well, it's a distraction, but what is a distraction? Is it that one cannot hear the spoken word clearly? Or is it that the mind wanders away? Possibly into thinking, why does this person have to move? I'm not moving. If I only had a quieter neighbor. Or can't he do it more attentively, or she? Then the mind is busy churning, and emotions are aroused of resentment or anger, and one cannot listen anymore to what is said right here, because the space has become very crowded and narrow, and the whole organism has become involved in activity. But that too can be seen for what it is without thinking, I shouldn't be this way. One can wake up to the fact that this is going on, and then can it be dropped instantly so that one can continue to listen? In this story, someone who I have read in the commentary traveled from the northwest corner of China to the south, which is a vast distance, stopping on the way, different monasteries for sesshin or retreat, whatever they call it. Gay it's called here, but that's probably I don't know what language. And then finally coming to this teacher, Umon, coming for instruction. Someone who's come a long ways and been in different places and finally here for an interview with a famous master who asks, where do you come from? And the answer is, from such and such a place. If we talk to each other, anytime we meet and we ask our new acquaintance, where do you come from? We want to know from which part of the country, or whether from this country, maybe from abroad. And the person answers. Is anything wrong with this answer? There's nothing right or wrong with it. Actually, very often, unless one is an unusually shy person, one loves to be asked where one comes from. One has waited for this question. Maybe nobody has paid much attention to one, and finally somebody asks, where do you come from? And now one has the stage, as it were, to tell. This can be observed in conversations that we have. Not that it's right or wrong to talk at length or in detail with great enthusiasm about where one comes from, one's past experiences, one's childhood. But just to be attentive to what's going on beside telling the story. Is there in one a great need to hear oneself talk, so that one is somebody in one's own and other people's eyes? Not necessarily exaggerating stories, although we do that too, to make them more important sounding. But just to feel one's existence as somebody worthy of being listened to, with an interesting past. Which, if one has this opportunity to tell, one feels good, it gives energy. Other people may enjoy one's story, the vividness of one's presentation. And yet, if nobody asks and it's other people's turn, one may feel the opposite, neglected or unimportant, lacking that energy and therefore easily depressed. I remember a person, an older woman, was a very depressed person, about a sense of no worth. And then she had a heart attack and was taken to a very fine hospital with lots of attention, lots of service, good nurses and fine doctors, great care. And that became the story of her life, to tell after she was released from the hospital. And every time in telling this, there seemed to be a glow about having been somebody interesting in such famous doctors' eyes. These were professors who were also teaching at the university. There was a big thing in her mind that she had been interesting to them in their care. Sometimes when we would take a walk, and the hospital was located not far from the home in a beautiful environment with a lovely view over a lake, you could feel that the person's heart was beating warmer. And she would point out, these are the parking lots where the doctors park when they come for their visiting hours, and these are their they are there right now. These are their visiting hours now. One has become the story of one's past. Uman is asking, where do you come from? And the answer is from such and such a place. It's not a story, but it's a place. A place on the map. Lots of thousands of miles away. And Uman asks again, where did you spend the summer retreat? Where did you go from there? And the answer is such and such at such and such a place. And then he asks for a third time, when did you leave there? And the answer is, on such and such a date, meaning a point in time, 5 weeks ago, 10 weeks ago, whatever time it took to get from there to here. So the whole space in which this Tozan lives is one of space and time. Where I was, when I was there, and now I'm here. His answer's coming out of memory. Remembering the place, remembering the time, and then the answer out of that memory. At this point, Uman just shouting at him or beating down on him. I spare you beating, or beating is what you need. He may not have shouted or beat or not beaten at all, may have given a different answer. Or made a different remark. But that's what he did. We must be careful not to now make an abstraction out of a Zen teacher's actions. They have to be rough or tough, shouted. We do that. It comes also out of reading stories. We get a very definite image of Zen teachers. And that this is where we have to go in order to become enlightened, to a teacher like that. The tradition seems to prove it, and all the stories prove it, because it always says, and then he became enlightened. And yet if an insight happens, it doesn't have anything to do whether the teacher there was rough or tough, or said nothing, or responded gently. It's the state of the mind of the questioner that matters. And of course, something in the interrelationship, which words cannot explain. But let us go back to the state of the questioner. Is it our state right now, thinking in terms of being here, coming from this state or that state of the union, from Rochester or from California, from Ohio? having left the night before yesterday, whatever that date was. I came from there and now I'm here. And I'm going to be here 1 more days, 2 more days, or how many more? Whatever, 5 or 6, 7 more days. This being oriented in space and time, which is a very limited part of the human brain, but the dominating part of our actions, of our life. Always fed from the memory structure. What I've done, what I'm going to do in the future, and I just happen to be here right now, but important is what happened in the past and what I will do in the future. What will happen to me if I do such and such and such. All the operation of thought and imagination and image, and not in touch with what's actually here this instant. Someone saying, where you come from? You know, one can take time with it. One doesn't have to fire an answer. It's not a bureaucrat who is asking this and is filling out a questionnaire. There you have to answer, or else, there's a long line behind you of other people who also need to answer. Don't want to hold them up, and you have to zip, 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 give your answers. And one has those ready, they're there. But someone asks you here, where do you come from? Where do I come from? And if one begins to wonder, right now, here, attending, wondering, not immediately referring to memory, because that'll tell me where I came from. I came from Wayside, over the bridge, and then in here. But that's the past. And the question may not ask about the past at all. It may ask, is there any coming at all? Apart from our factual moving from here to there, which is no problem. We can tell where we were. It's memory, and maybe correct memory or incorrect memory. But is there another way of being, another way of living, where attention disconnects what was and what will be, so that everything that's here now instantly is clear, unequivocally clear. It's not a state to be attained. If there's only memory and imagination, one can keep asking, what is there? Or who am I? Or just attend without a formulated question at all, listening, looking inwardly, wondering, without having an answer, because that's memory. That immediately puts me into my thought structure. And I'm wondering whether there's anything outside of that. Listen. Did that car come from someplace and go someplace? That's thinking. connected with memory of cars, of directions. Listen again. Where did it come from? Does it immediately trigger the thought process? See that. That's worth seeing. So one begins to understand how this mind works and puts us into a certain constructed world constructed of thoughts, memories, anticipations, which may have nothing to do with what is actually going on this instant. And what is actually going on is always only in the present. It's never in the past or in the future. It's only now. Maybe this is what Uman is knocking at. Where do you come from? After being sent off by the revered teacher, in the commentary later on it says, Tozan tossed all night or wallowed all night in the sea of yes and no, wondering what his fault was. What did I do wrong? What was wrong with my answer? And there was nothing wrong with it. On a certain level of being, on a certain level, which is the level of thinking, remembering and anticipating, times and dates, maps, calendars, there's nothing wrong with the answer. And yet he'd also wandered through a whole continent, a huge continent, to find out something. Maybe about who he actually was. What life was, what the universe was, or his relationship to it. And this brisk answer, in this case, rattled at his foundations. What did I do wrong? Or what's right and what's wrong? He may have thought it over and over and came to no satisfactory answer, and yet needed to continue wondering. Not knowing another answer. All he knew was where he was and when he left and the dates and times and places. That's what he knew. And yet that was thrown out, was rejected, was wiped away. What's left? When our habitual orientation to which we cling, who we are, what we see ourselves as, or what we want other people to see us as, what our purpose in life is, our past history, all of that is me. When that's wiped out or put into complete question, questioned completely, then what's left? But the question, the not knowing. In this case, for someone who must have had a considerable yearning to walk that far, that yearning or urge to find out was not squelched by Umon's whatever he did. Are you doing that right now? Wondering without knowing? Not understanding? And yet questioning or looking, listening, without an answer, not going back to memory for an answer, because it was wiped out here. In the story it says the next morning Tozan came back asking, "Yesterday you spared me a beating, I don't know what my fault was." And Umon's reply is, "You rice bag or good for nothing. Why do you keep wandering from east of the river to south of the lake? What are you looking for? In your mind, in your thoughts, which affect the whole body. What are you seeking? Why do you wander from one place to the other?" What does it say here? Have you been prowling around? That's sort of evaluative. It doesn't need to be that way. But one senses Tozan was beyond being hurt or insulted. That image of himself, or of ourselves that gets insulted, that wasn't there. That was long dropped. He didn't know. In a state of not knowing, you don't hold on to an image, so you can't be insulted. The only reason we get insulted is that we hold on to images of ourselves which we think are me. And if somebody doesn't cater to it or kowtow to it or respect it or insults it, hurts it, humiliates it, then we feel humiliated, insulted, hurt, not respected. But it's just an image that is affected. But we don't see that. We feel, our whole body feels depressed or elated, depending on praise or blame. Because we're so identified with all these various images we have of ourselves, therefore cannot freely relate to each other on the basis of no image and a full presence, in touchness with whatever goes on within and without. Images prevent that. They close us into a most vulnerable little chamber in which we're either ecstatic because of public acclaim, or it doesn't have to be a large public, can be a small public, one person telling us how terrific we are, and we glow with good feeling, and one person telling us how off we are, or conceited or vain or whatever, and we feel terribly bad or guilty, deflated. Can one look at that as one lives from moment to moment? It's so important. Sometimes people tell me, "Your talks are so shallow, you always talk about such superficial things. Talk about something deep for a change." See, in the shallow runs our life. A shallow life. And the reason some of these things are mentioned over and over, hopefully at times from a little bit a different angle. It is not easy to present it new, because it's the same old stuff. But there comes an instant in one's life where one does see it. Yeah. And it's a relief. At that moment it's not depressing at all. It's a relief to see that one is not an image, that there's just an image that runs one's emotions, triggers them. And to see is the release. Not thinking about it, but seeing it. And that seeing is neither shallow nor deep, if it is free of the me, free of judgments. Free, clear, unobstructed by our past training, whatever it may have been. So here in the case of Tozan, you could say there was added insult to injury. Being called a rice bag means just good for stuffing rice down the gullet. Good for eating and nothing else. And all his wanderings, which someone else may have praised, his arduousness for coming so far and for doing all these 3-month sittings, how marvelous a Zen student, are just blown to the winds. Where do you go prowling around from one place to another, from one monastery to another, from one teacher to another? And it didn't hurt his feelings at all, because there was no image. I was insight into this whole thing of seeking something in the future out of the past. That whole structure shattered. I wonder what he would have said if Uman had asked him again, where'd you come from? Maybe he would have said, I don't know. Completely open to what's actually happening. We will end here for today.